So just make sure we're recording. So welcome everybody. Welcome to week 4. So what I want to talk about now is I just want to start things off by talking about some upcoming deliverables and to just give you a heads up on the signature page. So let's start with talking about upcoming deliverables. So if you look on week 5, we have assignment 2 due. And so I'll just bring up the assignments list. And for assignment 2, this is a paper review. And so what you'll be doing is you'll be choosing a paper from a full paper from this year's ICSE or FSE conference. So this would be the most recent ICSE or FSE conference. And in your own words, you should write the following. So a summary that addresses what are some of the research questions, hypotheses, what are the motivations for the work, how did the authors conduct the experiment and case study, and did you notice any flaws in what they did and maybe some improvements that they could be making? What data did they use and how did they gather the data? What were the results? So what were their major findings? What was the main big primary reason why they did this work? And so what were some of their main findings? So this should be a write-up you do that's about 5 pages in length. You should submit your write-up as a PDF document. I would really encourage you to be writing your papers in using LaTeX or a very similar tool, and be writing your papers in IEEE or ACM format. So this is something that will take you a decent amount of time to do, but your summary should provide the reader with a full understanding of what the paper's about. And I'll actually change the paper length. We'll make the paper length 3 pages as long as you're using an ACM or IEEE double column format. So just to say that again, that'll be 3 pages single spaced, and I'll make sure to update the website before you guys read this to mention the page length. So these are just some of the topics that you can explore. If you want to explore other topics in your paper reviews or other areas, you should totally feel free to do that, okay? But these are just some of the areas that you can be expanding upon. And so the next area I wanted to address is the idea of the signature sheet. Now, you can find this signature page right on the main course website. And so it's under resources, and you click on this signature meeting page. And I'll just open this in Word. And so what this is this is a page that you'll have signed by your a potential faculty advisor. And this is just to show that you're meeting with the advisors, that you're making progress with coming up with your thesis or capstone project. I would really advise you be meeting with these advisors, emailing them sooner rather than later. You want to definitely be proactive. You want to definitely be proactive in these meetings. And you want to make sure you're meeting with people early and often. A lot of advisors will only be willing to take on 1, 2, or 3 capstone and thesis students. And so the sooner you can get with them, the sooner you can show them that you're interested in working with them, the sooner you can formally become involved with working with them, the better it will likely be. So this sheet is considered to be is reasonably informal. This is something that you submit to me. And so it's a way for me to keep track of who's working on what. Some people can sign this digitally, meaning if you're having an email conversation with folks, it's quite alright if they just type their name on this form. You don't need to actually have them sign it. You don't need to like drive a couple hours to campus or anything, or physically mail the document. So a digital signature for this is totally fine. And like I said, this signature page is entirely for me and to keep track of how people are doing with the course. Okay, so I'll just go back to the course slides. And so what I want to focus mostly on today is this idea of human studies. Now, there's a lot of ways you can collect information. You can collect information for studies, um, gathering information from public version control repositories, from running tools on different data sets, maybe measuring the precision, recall, and accuracy of different tools. There are a ton of different ways that you can gather data. So the method I want to discuss today is gathering data from human studies. Now, human studies are essentially any type of study that you do that involves humans. And this could be a survey that people fill out. This could be observing people using your tool. This could be using questionnaires to gather data. Frankly, it's any study that you do that directly involves humans. And when you're doing studies that involve humans, there's a lot of different considerations that you need to take into consideration, as opposed to studies that you do just involving computers or involving like version control data sets. Some considerations that you need to take are that humans can be hurt by doing human studies, and if it's not, I don't mean like physical harm, but maybe you're impacting their train of thought, maybe you're invading their privacy, maybe you're collecting information and you're not keeping it private when you should. So there are various ethical and privacy related concerns that you need to take into consideration when doing a human study. The other is that when doing a human study, you just can't say, well, I'm going to rerun my tool and recollect the data. If there's any issues, any problems with doing a human study, it can take a lot of time and a lot of effort to go through and recreate that study. I've done human studies before where I collected data from several hundred people and then come to find out there's a problem with one of my questions. Then you need to go through and rerun that study with several hundred people again, and it takes a ton of time. It's not as easy as rerunning a script. It's not as easy as rerunning some code that you have. It can take a ton of time and effort. So it takes much, much, much more planning as opposed to doing a typical computing-based study. Okay. Let's do my sanity check to make sure I'm still recording. And so if you're considering doing a human study, there is an IRB process, and I can discuss this process in greater detail with folks. And this is an IRB process you'll want to discuss much further with your advisor. But if you are doing a human study, you will want to make sure to go through the human studies training. And I have a link to this human studies training on the main course website under the resources tab. And I won't go through every piece of this training because it is on the RIT website and it does change from time to time. So I'll just point you to the website that you should be looking at. But what you'll need to do is you'll need to complete the human resource subjects training. And this training can take anywhere from 4 to 12 hours or maybe even more to do. It is all online, it is free, and there are instructions for doing this on the website. They have linked from the main course webpage. You will need to complete this training before you can even do a human study. So make sure that if you're thinking of doing a human study, make sure that you do this training. It does take time to do, so it pays not to wait till the last minute to do this training. Okay. So if you're thinking about doing a human study, make sure to do that training. So doing human studies have a variety of different purposes and different benefits. And one of the biggest benefits, I think, is that you gain quantitative and qualitative information. So when I say quantitative data, that's where you get a quantity of data. So in other words, it's saying 80 out of 100 people like chocolate ice cream as opposed to strawberry ice cream. Or 100 out of 120 people think Dan is the best looking guy in campus. The quantitative, you can think of those as just numbers. Qualitative, those are things like maybe, why do you like chocolate ice cream? And so somebody would respond with a sentence or two. Another question could be, do you think pickup trucks are safer than minivans? And then participants would give their response to that question. So you just can't merely bucket those responses into numbers. You just can't bucket them into numbers like you would if 80 out of 100 people felt a certain way, or if it took people an average of 5 seconds to respond to something. Qualitative is much harder to put into a bucket. And I think they're equally beneficial to be collecting in human studies. Now, obviously, it widely varies on the human study if you want to collect mostly qualitative or quantitative information. But that's something you'll want to discuss with your advisor. Human studies can support a wide range of activities, and so they could give you information like usability or accessibility feedback that computers just couldn't give you. You can measure how users might rate a certain app, what rating they would give it, how they feel about a certain app, so they can give different pieces of feedback. And there are a ton of other reasons why you might want to do a human study or include a human study in your work. So like I mentioned, before doing a human study, you must clear the work with Office of Human Studies. There are a couple forms that you'll need to fill out. There's an IRB form that you'll need to fill out, and you'll need to clear the work with this office before you conduct the work. And it generally takes about 2 to 5 weeks to get clearance from these folks, so it does take time. But like I mentioned, if you're thinking of doing a study, talk it over with your advisor, and they can help you further with this process. But I just want to give you a heads up that it does take time to do. So like I mentioned, the process, you'll complete the training, you'll submit the IRB, you'll wait for approval, and then you can begin the study. Anytime you change the questions you're asking or change the study, you need to go through the process again. So there are a lot of primary concerns when doing a human study. For the subject, the first rule is don't harm the user. And for most of the studies you're doing, obviously you probably won't be able to cause physical harm to the user, but you don't want to cause any kind of mental harm. You don't want to harm their privacy, so if you're collecting private information, you want to absolutely be sure to keep that private. And so sometimes information that we might not think would necessarily be private to certain people, and we may not feel that it would be private to us, could be considered to be very private to other individuals. So make sure you're cognizant of people's concerns. When you're collecting information that can be considered private, you want to come up with a plan for ensuring that you're going to keep this information private. One plan could be that if you store information, make sure to keep it non-identifiable. So if you're collecting information about specific users, and you have this data stored in a database, don't make it so anybody could ever tie that certain user's results into a specific user's name or find out who did it. So that's considered to be non-identifiable information. So it's one way to ensure privacy or anonymous feedback, because even if somebody gains access to the data, they'll never be able to figure out that some people respond in that way. And there are many more concerns, but frankly, they generally don't affect the vast majority of human studies. So some concerns you should have for doing a human study with, from a research perspective, is that it will likely require money. And it can require anything from $5 to $5 million, depending on the size of your study. So you'll want to do something to create an incentive for folks to actually participate in your study, and usually that means by compensating them. And so it'll likely mean that you need money. Maybe your advisor has money, maybe there's different avenues for getting the money, and so there are concerns. And as I mentioned earlier on, some of the other concerns is that you just can't repeat the study by pushing a button. It generally takes time and money, and is very frustrating to redo a study. So you want to spend tons of time making sure that you're asking appropriate questions, that you're not asking leading questions, that you are asking all the questions you should ask, and that you aren't asking questions that you shouldn't be asking. And finally, you want to make sure that you choose a good representative audience. It's kind of like if you were to go into Burger King and you asked people if they preferred McDonald's or Burger King, more people in there are probably going to say they like Burger King better. And the reason is because you are in a Burger King. So when you choose a representative audience, you want to make sure you choose an audience that is not biased, that doesn't include more males versus females or more computing people versus non-computing people. You want to make sure you choose an audience that's representative of the work that you're trying to do. If you were to go ask a bunch of people with Android phones if they prefer Android to iOS, they're probably obviously going to say Android. So therefore, you couldn't say that users generally prefer Android over iOS because it would be a biased result. So you want to make sure you choose a good representative audience when selecting your users. So there are a couple different study methods that you can do. A couple I have listed here are in person and online. So you can do an in-person study, and sometimes this could be an observation, like seeing how users like using a particular piece of software, seeing how they react to certain problems with the software. So this would typically be done in a laboratory-style environment. And there are a whole bucket of different rules that you need to follow when doing an in-person study, like not leading users, maybe not letting them know that they're being observed in certain situations. So that's a whole different ball of wax that I'm not going to discuss today. But there are a ton of different concerns that you need to take into consideration when doing an in-person human study. There are a variety of ways of doing online studies. One way is using mTurk, but an online study could be as simple as emailing developers from GitHub, or using an online survey like I mentioned, mTurk, or having users do something remotely. One important thing is that if you're doing a human study where you're analyzing empirical information, like you're analyzing version control info, and you're not asking users to do anything, that's usually considered to be outside the lines of a IRB or anything like that. So that's generally not considered to be a human study because nobody's actually interacting with you. You're just observing existing information. Okay. So when choosing an audience, you want to choose an audience that represents your target user group fairly, and make sure you don't lead the audience in questions. So an example of leading an audience in a question could be something along the lines of, why do you think this president or this person is bad? Right there, you're leading them to say that, to think that this person's bad when maybe they didn't think they were bad. Or you could say, why do you think this brand of car is better than others? Well, right there, you're leading the audience into thinking that that brand is already better than the other ones. So you'd want to make sure not to lead the audience in the questions. So one way to say that would be, how good of a job do you think the president's doing? Or which brand of car do you think is better, Ford or Chevy? So you'd want to make sure to ask questions that didn't lead the audience. Right? So this goes along the lines of asking appropriate questions, but another example could be of a assumptive question or a bad question to ask would be, how much do you think prices will go up next year? Maybe you could say, how much do you think gas prices will go up next year? Right there, you're making an assumption that prices will go up next year, and you're leading the audience. So a better question would be, do you think prices will go up next year? So you're still forcing the other person to think first, and then could possibly consider prices going up. So you want to make sure not to lead the user. So you want to make sure you don't implicate users in a way that what they're thinking. So you don't want users to think about the consequences or implications of current events as far as how they will link with future actions. So an example could be something along the lines of, if you go to that party tonight, what do you think will happen in your examination tomorrow? So you're already leading the responder into thinking about what will happen in the examination tomorrow if they go to that party. Like, hey, I shouldn't go to that party. You're leading them. Or if you vote for that political party, then what do you think will happen for taxes? What happened the last time they were in power? So right away, you're leading them to think that maybe that party will either raise or lower taxes. You're making an assumption on things, which is another example of a bad question. Another example of a bad question could be linked statements. And you can actually create leading questions by using the association principle around things you said previously, which you still have in mind for the person being questioned. So if you say something along the lines of, I really hate this government. What do you think about this particular party? Right there, you're saying, well, you hate this government, And if that party's in charge, maybe you're implicitly saying you're linking, I hate this different party. So again, you're guiding the user. Maybe you would ask, like, what do you think about John Richards? Many people are opposed to him, by the way. Right there, you're guiding the user into thinking negative things about that particular user. If I were to ask you, why do you hate Android? I hate it, by the way. I think it's stupid. Right there, you're guiding the person into thinking negative things about Android. So you want to make sure that you don't ask linking questions. So for asking appropriate questions, a very general leading question is where they're closed questions that clearly ask for an agreement, make it easier for the other person to say yes or no. So one example would be, do you agree that we need to save the whales? So you're asking the user for a very simple Boolean yes or no style question, and that can be good and can be bad. But in this case, you're really asking the user to agree with you, and if they disagree with you, it creates almost like a rift, almost like a, I don't know, for lack of better words, disagreement. And so the users will be much less likely to want to disagree with you. And so you don't want to make sure that you don't want to ask the user for agreement. You also don't want to ask coercive questions. So you don't want to ask questions that will try to make the user feel bad or try to make the user want to agree with you. So you're coming tonight, aren't you? If you aren't, then there will be trouble. You're trying to tell the user, hey, you should probably come to the party tonight. I'm telling you what's going to happen if you don't. So you're really guiding the user into agreeing with you or going along with what you say. Or, you do love me, don't you? Right away, you're making the person disagree with you if they don't answer the question that particular way. So you don't want to ask coercive questions to the user. Another example, and I'm just going to wrap things up in a bit, is crowdsourcing. And an example of gathering data is using crowdsourcing. And crowdsourcing is something that's really, really popular nowadays. It's used for a ton of reasons. Some could be used just for collecting user metrics. Other examples of crowdsourcing are figuring out what permissions an app can use. So there are a lot of different versions of crowdsourcing out there. So a basic definition of crowdsourcing is that you can get work or funding usually online from a group of people. So a very, very, very popular example of crowdsourcing is Wikipedia. So instead of Wikipedia creating and maintaining encyclopedia on their own, they rely on the crowd to create this encyclopedia for them. And so they do much more than, frankly, any encyclopedia company could probably do. And their web pages are, at least reasonably up to date. And so crowdsourcing in this case has been very, very helpful. Now, when relying upon crowdsourcing, one concern is quality. And like we've all seen with Wikipedia, quality can be taken into question. Like I could create a page right now saying I was the President of the United States. Somebody would take that down pretty quickly, obviously, but that information would exist for a short amount of time. So when relying on the crowd, it is a double-edged sword. You can get good info. You can get not so good info. So you just need to be cognizant of trying to ensure that you can get good information. So that's it for my lecture for today. So what I would like everybody to do next is find a paper which conducted a human study. Find a paper that where people conducted a human study in some way, shape, or form, and you want to describe some things like what are the main components of the study, how did they do it, what challenges they need to overcome, and what were some barriers they needed to overcome in collecting this information. And so these are some of the main things that you can address. You can address more of these items, you can address less of these items. But you should focus on what are the main components of the study. So with this, if you do it in a half a page to a page and upload it to the appropriate Dropbox, which I'll show you folks in a second. Let me open up the page. So it would be a 4-1 example of a human studies paper. If you can do it in, like I said, probably a half a page to a full page at most, that is completely suffice. So thank you very much, everybody, and I'll talk to you this week.